Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Ricardo Scucuglia, and on behalf of the Symposium Organization Committee, it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Andrea diSessa. The title of the keynote is 5 Powerful Ideas about Technology and Education. Dr. diSessa holds a PhD in physics at MIT, and he is Corey Professor Emeritus at University of California, Berkeley. He's a member of the National Academy Education and Fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Dr. diSessa has authored over 100 journal articles, book chapters, and books. His research centers on the role of intuitive knowledge in learning science and the development of computational literacies. I would like to thank and welcome Dr. diSessa.
All right, I'm very happy to be here. I didn't really know much about this meeting. It turns out that there are a fair number of people who know a little bit about me, which is very nice to feel that. I do have a split brain. About half of me does cognition of learning, and the other half of me does technology and use of it in teaching. But you can forget about the cognition of learning. I'm not going to be doing that today. So I'm going to be talking about, my title says, 5 powerful ideas about technology and education. Okay, so I've had this list of 5 ideas for, I should have computed this, about 8 years or so, and I'll tell you that I'm really happy with the list. I'm usually always changing my mind and adding things and taking things away, but this list has been very stable. It seemed like the right list when I made it up, and it still seems like the right list. So this is kind of my taste in powerful ideas, high-level ideas. That's kind of my specialty. And this is probably the single best sentence for introducing this talk. The computer is a once in several centuries innovation. I thought I heard Herb Simon say that, a famous computer science AI person, used to be at Carnegie Mellon. But I checked with him and he didn't remember ever saying that. So maybe I should just claim that for my own. But that's a big deal. Once every several centuries. That's a time scale that we just don't usually think about. And that's going to be a constant theme in this talk, how to think about this very big, long time scale picture. So new and wondrous glitzy things are just fine. We get those kind of every day, but I'm maintaining that we need to keep an eye on and work toward what is inevitably a very long time horizon. We need to understand this, several centuries thing, or at least take it into account somehow. And it's very hard to get that stuff into your head. And how it's relevant. It's easy to say, oh, well, those centuries will take care of themselves. But I don't believe those centuries will take care of themselves. And I believe that we can go down wrong paths. I believe that we can learn a lot by charting some ways for future educations. But there are many things that we need to take into account. One is long-term futures are not going to look like the present. They're not going to look like what we think the present will be in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. So it's a difficult task. And I expect that some or most of you will be skeptical about some of the things that I talk about in this presentation. And I would love to hear from you about that. So, okay, so here's the fundamental metaphor. This is big idea number 1, computational media and new literacy. So the metaphor is text is written representation that everybody knows produced what I'm calling here an old literacy, a literacy based on text. A really marvelous thing that it did for us. And the metaphor is simply that computational media, now we should be developing computational media. That's already a bit bold because computational media, what's a computational media? What are you talking about? But we need computational media, and we need to explore what kind of a new literacy we can create with that. And I just want to take a moment to reflect on what old literacy, conventional textual literacy has done for us. So it's not incidental to say that it created modern civilization. Science could not exist without textual literacy. History, of course, didn't exist before people could write things down. School textbooks, law, a nation of laws, something that's very important to me. Well, that just can't exist without words on paper. Government, business, literature, just think through your daily lives and how much literacy is a basis for those things. So here we're looking at computational literacy, but any literacy takes a long time, centuries at least, I say here. Textual, these are wonderful things to read about. I'll give you a few tidbits, but textual literacy, you probably all know this, was bottled up for centuries in an elite class. It was something for scribes in ancient Egypt, and you know that the production of the Gutenberg Bible introduced really the technology for mass literacy, that movable type, you could print off a bunch of copies and didn't have to transcribe them by hand. So a big event. So interesting fact for mathematically oriented people, algebra took about 300 years to become a mass literacy. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Where did algebra? You probably were told things about that algebra existed in where the Arabs. I can't remember the names now. I'm sure you got those myths. But it's the representational system that's important, and that got started with Descartes in sort of 1637. So the trek to algebra becoming a mass technical literacy, and the analogy now is we're going to jump to computational literacies, not algebra, but that was just as Galileo was finishing his work. So Galileo did not have algebra. That's the punchline of a slide, a couple hints from this one. So here's another kind of shocking thing, at least it is for me. In 1955, only 25% of US high school students took algebra. 1955, let's see, I don't know where I was. I was in elementary school somewhere during the time. So it's not that long ago. Now algebra is accepted as a literacy, and the rates are really quite high. That people who get algebra courses, and how that happened, how algebra was actually quite big, and then it was depressed by some educational researchers that said it was stupid. I could tell you that story, but I'm not going to tell you that story. And then it came back and really got a boost from a government report after Sputnik, when the US government was panicking about the Russians having better technology and better trained scientists than us. So there was a report called The Nation at Risk. And it, as far as I know, it had its effect. That was really the beginning. That was 1958 or something like that. That was really the beginning of the rebirth of algebra. So I'm implicitly making the argument that this is gonna take a while, right? Maybe a century, maybe more than that. I don't know. Does anybody have the patience to consider that. Well, we have to do things now, but the point is we can do things pointing in good directions, or we can get stuck by the past or stuck in contemporary technology. People often say to me, but everything's changing so fast now. Everything just changes so fast. But what is changing? And if you're talking about a new literacy, my slogan is a literacy needs a literature. Okay, so what's the classic literature of computation, right? Well, I just don't think there is any, right? So what we need is a huge literature for kids, for high schoolers, for adults, for philosophers. We need this literature. And literatures are not easy things to build. They take time. So here's the question: how long does it take to create a profound body of literature in new media? And I think it's going to be a long time. How long to create the social infrastructure for teaching a new literacy? Well, people are trying to do that by the name of coding or computational thinking, but they're not thinking about creating a new literacy. They're thinking about teaching kids coding, and that's kind of whatever that's good for, it's not on the trajectory that I want to argue for. Yeah, I'm an opinionated person, not often combative, but sometimes. But I do think that some aspects of what's happening now are just going in the wrong direction, and I'll give you a little taste of that. Some of you can probably say that to yourselves, have seen me talk or read some of my papers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about literacies. The first element here is I want to talk about secrets about conventional literacy and corresponding more or less myths about new media literacy. And a lot of people, probably not here. This is an interesting community. There are multiple communities here, and they all have different views of this and where we're going and how far we are. And my guess is you're much more realistic than most people, and you're much less subject to misinformation about education. But in this context of thinking about a new literacy, you just know that that's not a thing that happens overnight or in one class or 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. Becoming literate is something that happens across lifetimes, right? So that's what I want to think about. And the myth associated with that, kind of the opposite of that, is that, well, technology is getting better and better, and we can tell that because, like the Macintosh, we don't need any instruction. There's nothing that we need to learn, and that's not a literacy, right? That's not. I think I'll just leave it at that. You're not talking about literacy if you're talking about if ease of use is the first thing that you're thinking about it. The second point is that literacies are radically democratic. That means everybody both reads and writes. Okay, so there's a lot of people that are happy for students to use educational applications, and whatever that is, that's not a literacy. Teachers and students, just from the analogy, I'm asserting this is a literacy, or this can be a literacy. It will have to be a two-way literacy, not a one-way literacy. So that's the corresponding myth. It's a one-way literacy. Some expert somewhere will make these great apps, and students will learn math, and teachers will just bring in the latest app, and everybody will be happy. No, that's not the way this is going to work. If it works at all like I expect it will. And then the final point is this: literacy pervades everything. You know, it makes our civilization, it makes our society. And this is particularly bad in certain sub-communities, the idea that, well, we're teaching kids to program so that they can get a job as a programmer. They can get a job in technology. Well, you know, that might well be true, but that's not what the literacy project is. It's not about, it turns out to be false, but that's a different talk. If you just look at the trajectory of jobs, wind turbine engineers and specialty nurses have much better prospects for getting jobs and being paid well than programmers. Most people who make things with computers. So this is a fundamental cognitive point. The structure of the representational system in large part determines its expressiveness. So you got to look at the system that people are being literate in, and you got to make use of its properties. That's how you get purchase on ideas, and you get purchase on some ideas and no purchase on other ideas. So algebra, you know, is pretty good for a lot of things in science, but not so good for, it's not so good for the arts, for example. But that's going to be very different with computational literacies. So now we're adding dynamical and interactive properties to text. That's one of my sort of challenging points of view. We're not abandoning text, we're augmenting text. We can argue about that if you like. What do you get? And what can you do with it? And how do people think differently? So big picture, full stop. I don't see how new media can fail to support a radical new literacy. I've last asked my friends in language and literacy at Berkeley. They have too low. It turns out they have too low a bar for literacy. So one professor asked me, "Well, is computation a representational system, or does it involve a representational system?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, then it can be a literacy." And what I'm talking about, that's not good enough. You know, it doesn't touch society, doesn't touch culture, doesn't touch literature. So that's not a definition of a literacy that I'm willing to sign up for. So I'm going to be a little polemical for a few moments. I'm going to talk about this idea of computational thinking, and I'm going to talk mainly to one subcommunity that has had a very strong influence. I don't know whether you know the history. Jeanette Wing, a computer scientist, really created computational literacy. As a computer scientist, but it's kind of a weak idea. So let me talk about that. So computational thinking, computational thinking, you know, is very ambiguous. So some people give it good meanings and some people give it, you know, kind of questionable meanings. And Jeanette Wing did all the bad stuff that you can imagine. I'm sorry to be polemical, but computational thinking a la Jeanette Wing is blind to knowledge, to real knowledge. It's blind to physics, it's blind to mathematics. There's no serious literate focus. There's no literature there. It's computer science for computer science. And in fact, in one of her late papers, she said, well, okay, we've got this project to teach computational thinking. Now, the task that's left is to figure out how to order the computer science topics. So right there on the page, you can go read that. Well, that's just not, that's not sensible within a computational literacy perspective. So yeah, I have a little counter principle here, which is kind of a good starting place, which is that people should learn programming only enough to treat the topics that they need to learn in mathematics or physics. Now that's a little bold, but it's a good starting place. And you'll see reflections of that in some of the work that I report in a few minutes. So here's another one, Jeanette Wing and a lot of people. I saw this advertised in the computer science department at Berkeley, and I was kind of shocked there. Jeanette Wing says, you'll automatically learn these powerful general skills like abstraction. She has a list that is very similar to what Polya did in the 1940s. So right away, I'd want to know, why is your list better than Polya's? And when did he write? Mathematicians help me, 1947, 1957. How to solve it, right? But I was looking for the date. Doesn't matter. I was kind of thinking 47, but 49. Well, okay, a long time ago, right? And so Jeanette Wing comes and says, these are the general skills that you learn, and they're sort of really, in an unlikely way, the same kinds of things that Polya was talking about. So did Polya take over the universe? No, he didn't. Well, he did for a time, but that's kind of so that's an interesting thing to talk about. But in a paper that I'm not going to talk about in any detail here. 45. Okay. Ace in the hole. Okay, so I did a study of some of those skills and the actual psychological data on learning those skills, and you should read some of that stuff. And ever since Plato, people have thought that you learn, for example, mathematics is a big one, Latin. But in the early 20th century, people were talking about these general skills of generalization. Everybody made a different list, but this idea that some disciplines are special and give you access to intellectual power keeps coming back and keeps coming back. And then there are studies and theory, looking at the particular ones. Thorndike did a huge study, sort of 1930-ish, about what used to be called faculty psychology, about the faculties that you developed by learning mathematics or Latin or something like that. And he did this massive study, incredible for the time, before computers, and he found zero results. And my attitude is most of those things just don't exist. They are not knowledge. They're not things. Maybe they're in some cosmic world. They're a kind of knowledge, but those things don't fit in people's heads. Abstraction is one that she touts. And this goes back to Thorndike. What's the problem with abstraction? Well, the problem is that abstraction is a name given to a whole cluster of skills that are different depending on the context. So the thought experiment is here: is mathematical abstraction the same as empirical abstraction? Or do mathematicians do the same thing at a high level as physicists? And my intuition, I'm not going to make this into a hard-nosed argument. My intuition is that that's just not right. Mathematical abstraction is in a completely different intellectual system where the game is proof. So you discover things, and they're very abstract, because they're not necessarily connected to the world. But that's, and then I was a physicist. So what do we abstract in physics? Well, you can play this game. I think it's a fun game. Okay, so representations change the ways we can think and know. So I like to describe them as material intelligence. Each representational system offers specific affordances and specific constraints. I'm going to go over some familiar ground. Some of you will know this, but I didn't want to let some of these things pass by. I think this one, for me, was the most compelling example of representations changing intellectual worlds that I know of. There are conventional, examples of Roman numerals were crummy for calculation, so Arabic numerals are much better. But this one gets the heart of science, which is kind of where I live. I don't care if everybody can calculate. So for me, Roman numerals are probably fine. Well, that's an exaggeration, but so I was always a fan of Galileo, and I read in his dialogues concerning two new sciences. He has a long section, I don't know, 15, 20 pages in his De Motu, which is probably the most famous part of his work, where he describes motion mathematically. And it's the first time that's done. And I don't know if you've read Galileo's dialogues, but they're so elegant and clear and transparent. And he meant to be talking to the common person. That's why he wrote in Italian. He didn't write in Latin, which was traditional. But there's this section that he turns pedantic and just like all of a sudden it becomes a math textbook, and I never could figure out what was going on. So let me show you a little bit more of the puzzle that I was trying to work on, and then the solution, which probably is already obvious, but here's what Galileo did. He structured his discussion around 6 different theorems, and this is theorem number 1. If a moving particle carried uniformly at constant speed traverses 2 distances, then the time intervals required are to each other in the ratio of these distances. Probably that should be very familiar to you, but I'll keep going. Here's theorem number 2. If a moving particle traverses 2 distances in equal intervals of time, these distances will bear to each other the same ratio as their speeds. And conversely, if the distances are as the speeds, then the times are equal. Well, you can probably do that in your head. Here's theorem number 4. I'll save you from the rest. If 2 particles are carried with uniform motion, but each with a different speed, then the distance covered by them during unequal intervals of time bear to each other a compound ratio, that is the product of ratios of the speeds and time intervals. Well, it's kind of wordy for one thing. And then he proves each of those theorems, and this is theorem number 1. Okay, so I don't know, why is he doing this? Why does he have to prove all of these separate theorems which to our ear sound very familiar? And I'll let if the cat isn't already out of the bag, I will let it out in just a moment. That's his proof. And let me tell you, and I think you can trust me on this, but go check for yourself. This is hard stuff, okay? He's doing some real exotic mathematics, especially for the times. I think it's still unusual. So it's very hard to read. Why is he doing this? He was trying to explain his studies to the common Italian folks. Why is he doing this? So the secret is algebra didn't exist for Galileo. Algebra got started, the notation got started in Descartes' work, which was just within a few years when Galileo published his last work. So Galileo didn't know algebra. And so just to beat a dead horse, if you can say D equals RT, distance equals rate times time, then all of those theorems are just trivial consequences of that any high school student who couldn't do those would be thrown out of algebra class. So just to, as I said, beat a dead horse, the ratio of distances is equal to the ratio of rates times the ratio of times. That's distance equals rate times time in terms of ratios, which was the form for the day. And then you see if the rates are the same, then the R terms cancel, and the ratio of the distances is the ratio of the times. And that was his theorem number 1. So what's, the puzzle is gone now. He couldn't say distance equals rate times time. There was no notational system for it. So for whatever what are written in math texts, the people who originated algebra, they were not talking about the representational system that we know that is so important for making algebra instrumental. And just, I'm not going to even read through this, but there are the proofs of all the rest of the theorems in terms of algebra. They're just trivial. So I'm interested in teaching motion, and we're going past algebra. What if we had a representation that's easier to learn, much better adapted to motion, and much more broadly applicable compared to algebra? Thank you very much. Well, and way more fun. Okay, so that's, to me, that's a big deal, and I'm proud of that. More fun, and you'll see that in the margins and a lot that I show. So, no mystery. Programming is a notation, and it's very well adapted to motion, which is where we started in teaching physics. In particular, we taught a year-long class to 6th grade students in 1989, 1990. I'm going to be showing you some programs from 1989 and 1990. So it's pretty much freshman physics, or certainly high school physics, mechanics, without algebra, without calculus. So that's the challenge. And we said in our proposal that we were going to teach kids vectors as well, because we thought we could teach vectors. And one liner, the National Science Foundation says, "You're crazy. You're going to teach 6th grade kids vectors." I know my high school kid just doesn't understand vectors at all. So the common sense is that just doesn't work. Well, I'll tell you, rather than trying to prove it to you, that the National Science Foundation was just dead wrong we took vectors out of the proposal, but we did vectors, and it was a great experience. Now, in the next few slides, you're going to be seeing a strange programming language called Boxer, which we developed starting in the, I guess, mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s, and it stopped being a thing about a decade ago, but we're rebuilding it now. So if you're interested, pretty soon we'll have a new Boxer. But here's how we represent motion in Boxer, and this is kind of the culmination of work that we did with students, where we show them these two models that are meant to show what velocity and acceleration are. So with some lag, my cursor is up there on the screen. So we've got a variable here called speed. We've got a procedure here with sharp corners called run. That's the top level procedure. All of you can track this. And then there's the low level procedure. Each tick of the clock, you move. You can think about a turtle or a sprite on the screen moving the distance that we call here speed. And here's the tick model for acceleration. It's just the same thing, except we have another variable called acceleration. It says move speed and change the speed to speed plus acceleration, increment the speed by acceleration. So that's what we taught 6th grade students to understand velocity and acceleration. And here's the vector tick model. We implemented vectors in Boxer, and they're just boxes. You press a key and out pops this box with an arrow in it, and you drag the mouse around. It's just like a kind of super number, and then you can add them. You can just do stuff with them. It's just it's a super number. It's just and all it takes is a keystroke to make one of these things. And here's the tick model, including acceleration. The top level is the same. The next level is mostly the same, except for its vectors instead of numbers. You move a small amount, which we call the velocity, and then we increment the velocity by the acceleration. It's the same thing, except that the addition is vector addition rather than scalar addition. And this is literally one of the microworlds that we had some of those 6th grade students work on. This is, yeah, I'm not gonna, so there are a bunch of exercises here, but you see right here in the middle is the tick model. And that's the whole program that is making this thing run, okay? So I'm gonna make a big deal about that in a moment. You can decide whether you're worth it, it's worth it. So let me just, and that's me dragging the velocity vector. And now I'm going to point it down. You probably all are very familiar with how velocity works, but nobody can miss what a vector velocity is with an experience like this. I mean, you just can't. It's so experientially salient, just kind of just obvious. And this is the. Now I'm going to control acceleration. And of course, this gets complicated because acceleration is hard to see and it's very hard to control things with acceleration. But that's kind of the point here. And I'm just going to show you a run by me, yours truly, trying to do this exercise that we set to the kids of driving the spaceship here in more or less a circular orbit around a planet. And I'm gonna do that. I found myself doing this, only trying to make sure that the acceleration is toward the planet. So that's all that I was trying to use, just that knowledge in order to make the rocket ship go around the Earth. And so this is me doing my honest best. So I was doing pretty good for a while, and then whoa, I slowed it down too much. Nah, I speeded it up too much. So I have to go backwards. So that's my best first try in 20 years at using acceleration. So there are a couple of things here. One is that students got way better than any of us at managing this kind of thing. And it's also true that there's a lot to learn about acceleration and how it controls motion. And now you just see this, few lines of code, you can begin just playing with that. So here's the summary of what happened with vectors. We were prepared. We were a little shocked by the National Science Foundation, so we prepared a lot of some teaching materials to teach vectors. It turned out it's essentially just not needed. So they just looked at what happened and they learned from that. So they learned very, very easily about vectors, and a lot of that was because they really loved vectors. Vectors were really cool things for them. And so they just played with them all the time and developed a lot of, good intuitions about how to control things with acceleration, the kind of thing that I bet I should do this study. I'll bet most freshmen couldn't do nearly as well, even in talking about how acceleration works and how you manipulate it to create certain motions. But the last one is on a different theme. They used vectors as user interface devices for computer games they invented. So a lot of the work that students did here, not by any means all of it, but a lot of it was making computer games for themselves and for each other. And the vector is just a user interface device that they used. So the bigger theme is extending and improving engagement and activity structures. That the modes of engaging students in various disciplines. And I'm going to write a physics textbook, but I hate textbooks. I hate traditional textbooks. I think they're designed optimally to keep students from understanding stuff. So that's a long discussion. But in any case, what's clear is the activity structures of high school or college physics courses are really minimal still, even with technology. Yes, there are some changes, there are some sprouts, but the traditional high school or college physics class is so passive and so boring to me. I always loved physics, and I always hated physics textbooks. I got my PhD in physics. Of course I loved physics. I hated my physics class. I was just not interested. I wanted to make stuff. So I mean, that's a background that I have better rationale for it now, but that's still a very deep part of me. So computational media, we can create opportunities for much more authentic and personally involving activities, like making your favorite motion video game. Yeah, so I showed you kind of minimal interactive modes, but especially if you get students into longer term projects. We did a lot of short-term things. We did this, I showed you a vector micro world that was, you know, a day of students, you know, working with that, and intermediate things. But the bigger picture, jumping back up to the computational literacy thing, is we really want to change the whole repertoire of activity structures that students engage in. I'm particularly interested in design, and the times have kind of caught up with me in the sense that design is an official topic that people want to teach these days. State of Massachusetts has legislated that in high school students need to learn design, but one of the things that's even more important to me is that that's a way of personalizing. That's a way of putting yourself into this this subject matter by taking it and doing design with it. So we beyond that 1 year class, of course, I've done a lot of work with physics in bits and pieces, never at that scale, but we've had, you know, high school students build bridges and understand you know, kind of the statics of bridges by building them and seeing which ones fall down and why did they fall down, that kind of thing. I have a system for them to design simple optical systems using, you know, stupid simple models of what lenses do, and they can examine things like distortion and put together a telescope or something like that. And next I'm going to be showing you some work that we did on scientific visualizations with students. Modeling extends from elementary school deeply into college, lots of activities for lots of different levels of kids. So, and this is quite differentiated. It's not one thing really. Sometimes we ask kids to make models of really core ideas, like Galileo's reconceptualization of a fall. Or we asked high school kids to design Newton's laws. And we also did thermal equilibration. So we did those as contexts where students are kind of open-ended modeling, but the goal for us is to help them get to a really good computational framing of these ideas. And exploratory learning, I wrote this textbook with Hal Abelson on exploratory approach to geometry. And this is, I'd love to talk about this because it's a very interesting thing. What we did with orbital mechanics is a standard thing to teach in first or, you know, you set first or second course in physics, but it's so deadly dull. But it isn't, but you have to know a little different to get into all the fascinating things. And it happens that perturbation theory turns out to be the trick to turning orbital mechanics from this deadly dull thing, circles and ellipses, and that's all there is to say about it, to something to explore and to try to understand, to build simulations, to make things happen. And I wish I could spend an hour on that. This is a long time ago, so I would struggle to get the programs and results that kids had, but they did remarkable things. I'm going to go back to what we did with our 6th grade kids with Galilean Fall, and I know many of you have seen this before. So those of you who've seen it too many times can just go to sleep for 5 minutes and come back. But we asked students to show us how things fall. And for the 6th grade kids, we asked them, show us how a penny falls if you threw it off the Empire State Building. And we gave them this starter model: repeat 20 times, go forward and draw a dot. Okay, so it's obviously defective. It doesn't even get to the bottom, doesn't even get to the ground. It just doesn't look right. There's nothing about it. So it just stimulates, okay, you do better. So this is Galileo's model. You've seen this before. The acceleration is constant. That's Galileo's model. That is one of his life's greatest achievements, is to figure out that just in a falling object is really simple. It just, you increment the speed by an amount that's proportional to the time. And here's the program. Those are the dots. So I'm going to do this kind of in reverse order. I'm going to show you, where Galileo got, and then I'm going to be talking about the paths that students traversed to get there. And I guess I can say already that we've done this dozens and dozens of times. We did this with a bunch of teachers in Wisconsin who had never programmed anything at all. So this turns out to be a really accessible activity, an interesting activity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So net result is the students converge. They always converge. They always come down to believing that 1 or 2 models are probably right, and everything else gets left behind. So that's really interesting. How do they do that? And I'll tell you a little bit about how they did that. So the path to creating a Galilean model, or another model that's Galilean, but he decided was wrong. How could they do that? So let me just show you a bunch of student models and kind of place them in the learning sequence. So the Galilean idea is pretty accessible, and some of our students, I don't think. Wow, okay, none of our students in 6th grade started with this, but some of our students in high school just started with this. They just wrote down Galileo, and I said, well, I think that's the way it should go. So it's accessible, and it's also culminating. Also, it's something to argue for, to hope that it comes out of the dynamic of the class, that they say, oh, that sounds right. That sounds really good. Student model number 2, multiplication by a constant amount. So Galileo actually treats this. He proves that it's impossible. That turns out not to be explainable to kids. It's just too much mathematics there. So we cheated, and we took some data. I guess that's not cheating. We made a stroboscopic image of drops and tosses of balls, and then we had them try to make a program that moved the ball over those points. Very easy. We made that activity the day before we ran it. It worked all great. So here's just another point. Oh, this guy started out, I think this was a high school student. He started with forward 20, forward 19, 14. So he looks like he's making it slow down. Okay. We talked to another pair of students who did the same thing. Not this guy, so I don't really know how he was thinking, but they said, oh, we were not trying to make it go faster. We were trying to show that it was going faster. So more dots to them meant going faster. So this is subroutine to lecture on invented representations. I'm just not going to do that. But there's an interesting point. So he was looking around and everybody was doing the conventional Galilean kind of thing. So he turned his around and joined the group, as it were. But here he's a very good example of a thing that happened a lot early on. They're not uniform. So he does increments of 2 and then he does increments of 1. So why does he do that? Well, I don't know why he did that. Can a kid argue him out of that? Yes. A kid can argue another kid out of it. Why would it change? You know, so uniformity is an intuition that a lot of kids and teachers have, and that's part of the input that makes this work as an activity. This one I quite like. So he changed the simulation system. Instead of making dots, he made dashes, and the dashes are to represent speed. And he just changed the program where the dot draws a vertical line of a certain size. I love that innovation, and the system was open to that. This is just generic boxers, so he could do anything that he wanted. So I really like this one because I watched a pair of girls in, it was a 5th grade class in Wisconsin doing this exercise, and they created this model. And I said something like, yeah, it looks like it goes faster, but then it slows down. Why would it slow down? And without missing a beat, one of the girls said, well, it has to stop when it gets to the bottom. So I can't argue with that, right? So there's a lot of creativity here in this stupid, simple task. So I really love it. So yeah, I already told you that we did the stroboscope to disambiguate some people. So the 2 convergences are, a lot of people like Galileo. Some people like the multiplicative model. The speed is proportional to distance model. And we tried kind of arguing them out of sort of Galilean arguments, but his are just too hard. That didn't work. So as I told you, we did the empirical approach. So meta points on this. This is what I describe as within epsilon of not programming. These students they're programming, but this is really basic stuff. This is almost day 1 stuff, but they're doing really wonderful things. And I just love that combination. And the slogan is probably not one that I want to take too literally, but there's a lot of learning. This was a lesson for me. There's a lot of learning going on in this physics class, and a lot of it had to do with the simplest possible programming that you can imagine. So the students complained that we spent too long teaching them Boxer. We spent 2 weeks at the beginning of a year, and they said, oh, that was way too long. We should have just got started. Okay, so I'm going to have to, I'm sorry, I'm going to accelerate. They themselves made huge projects, so it wasn't, so them learning more than simple turtle graphics turned into a real engagement hook for them. And I think I'm going to try to cut this short a little bit because I want to get to the end. So, this is modeling, but what's the modeling system? It's just a programming language, right? So, and you'll see variations on that, where programming is not really the big issue. It's there, but what you're doing with it is modeling. So here's, I have 2 more. I think I can do it. It'll probably be 5 minutes over, but so open tool sets. This is an idea that we got out of our own practice. These ideas came with a lot of work. So they didn't just pop into my head one day. So here's the dilemma. Programming generic resources are really powerful things. You can use them forever. You learn it and you can use them and you can do anything. You're unconstrained. But on the other hand, there's what computer scientists call the Turing tar pit. and that is everything is possible, but nothing is easy. So what I'm going to show you is kind of bridging that problematic gap between programming per se and learning from some subject matter. So this is about adapting programming to specific topics. And the idea that I call open tool sets is to build generic resources that everybody can inspect, modify, and extend. So they're things that you can open up, look inside. There's all the code for them there. Lots of stories about kids opening up our code and stealing ideas. It happened all the time. This is not a fairy tale, that kids can open these things up and both learn from them and take stuff that's useful for them. And in Boxer in particular, these resources are typically just a graphical chunk, just a visual thing that you can cut and paste, move anywhere you like, or you can duplicate it. If you want a grapher, or if you want whatever you want 5 of them, just cut and paste, copy and paste. So you'll be seeing more of that. And they're combinable, they're computationally combinable, they're activatable by mouse, but you can also send messages, programming messages to them. I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the technology. So I showed you vectors already, a really simple toolkit, and it doesn't say anything about what you do with it. You can do anything you like with it. So I love that. I'm going to show you some work with visualization tools, and then the last thing we're going to do is use it for a different purpose. Going to talk about this thing called Chart World, which has the same kind of model of objects that specialize programming to specific areas. So this came from, I had a friend in the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory who's an astronomer, and he was interested in teaching kids about astronomy, and he had a project called the Hands-On Universe. And what he did mainly was have students grab pictures from, in those days it was the Hubble telescope, it would be the Webb telescope now, and analyze them, study them, which is what he did for a living. He looked for supernovas. So there's an exercise later on for kids to show how he found supernovas. They could understand, they could replicate that in these tools. He had kind of a dumbed down version of the image processing tool that he used professionally. And it had all the wrong properties for us. It was opaque. Kids didn't understand how it worked. They had all kinds of misconceptions about what was happening. And there was nothing they could do with it but kind of analyze astronomical pictures. So we wanted to change that. We wanted to make our own version. And this is just a bunch of objects. I'll talk very quickly through them. They're independent tools that you can put together in any combination to do whatever you want. So this on the left here is an image that you might see out of the Hubble telescope. It is an image that came out of from the Hubble telescope. And over here you have a zoom thing. You can make it bigger and smaller. It's just a button that you click and it make it bigger and smaller. Buttons are just sort of generic objects in Boxer. I wrote a little thing called a button factory that will make you buttons of any kind of shape and color that you like, and in particular it can make those kinds of plus and minus buttons. So now you have what these pictures are just an array of numbers, right? They're an array of brightnesses. And what you do is to map those numbers into colors, or black and white, shades of gray. So we made the color sequence that you map into. Here's the typical one. You start, the low numbers are dark and the high numbers are bright. But you can do all these other, we made a palette warehouse, and students can make their own palettes, deliberately hoping that they would do something other than what we told them to do with it, right? So we wanted genuine initiative and engagement. And I'll tell you one story about that. I don't need to explain all of these. This is a slice graph. So what you can do is drag a line across the your image, and then you get a graph of values. And if you drag this little red thing across the graph, it lights up the segment that you drew it from, and shows you the numerical values here, and you know where those values are. So it turns out to be a really simple tool, but now that's enough. Here's what we call a data peeker, so they can actually look at the numbers. There are other ways, but a part of it that turned out to be really, really important was color. It's just allowing kids kind of free reign in playing with color. And I'll tell you one story about that. But we made these little tools for creating palettes, and this tool for making colors. Nothing. So these are just things that you can cut and paste into your world if you happen to want to do those kinds of things. So they're very typical Boxer tools. They're just a box. You can cut it and paste it and then use it. And if you want more copies, you make more copies. If you don't want it anymore, you just press the rub out button, the delete button. So the remarkable thing was shocking to me. We were very late preparing for a summer class on I don't remember exactly what we're concentrating in the summer class, but we're on a deadline for starting the class. We wanted to have our image processing stuff in the class. And what happened was that my graduate students and I, mostly my graduate students, developed about 10 exercise microworlds using these tools over the course of a couple of weeks. And most of that was design and try out, because it's so easy to make these tools. And just to underscore, my students were not professional programmers by any means. Many of them hadn't programmed before they joined my research group. They learned programming a little bit in order to engage with the big project of the time, which was our sixth grade class. So these are not experts by any means, but they produced really interesting materials on very short order by doing just a little bit of Boxer programming. I'm just two examples here. The first one that I thought was really nice, just ask kids to take a picture of themselves and then use the image processing tools to, for example, turn your nose blue. So I don't know how many of you are Photoshop experts, but that's really hard because the color is not characteristic of the nose. It's all over and especially if you reduce it to black and white, there's a lesson. You can't do that, or it's really very hard to do that. One that I built in a day or two. The metaphor was that you're at an archaeological site that I called Gezer, and there are two pyramids and an obelisk, and you're to figure out how big these things are and where they are in this archaeological site using the image processing tools. And one of the tricks to make it hard was some of the spatial attributes were too small to be resolved with the size of those color bands. So they had to do something in order to find the small detailed work. Very quickly, Dean was an artist. Yeah. Dean was an artist, and he just loved the colors. He spent all of his time where we weren't looking over his shoulder, playing with color. playing with those color tools and drawing pictures in different colors and so forth. But he also did the work that we asked them to do. And Dean and his friend Peter, I think it was just Dean, were responsible for this great invention, which got named zebra palettes, alternating high contrast colors as a great way to get information out of a diagram like this. You get the magnitude contrast, you get sort of isoclines, whatever they're called, and that that just visually solved some of the problems that we posed them in this class. Beth really liked making kind of Photoshop-like things, and this is a production. She made a micro Photoshop. I don't have time to explain how far she got, but here's one of her creations, and she called it Cheshire. And her smile is just disappearing. So if you have a controller, you can watch it getting fainter and fainter. And so that's Alice in Wonderland, the cat that disappeared all but its smile. So, and I just, this is subverting our learning goals. Is that what it is? No, it's allowing students to find their own learning goals and their own activities. So the last thing, I think I can do this in 5 minutes, is a thing that I call the ladder model. And it's a model for software development that responds to problems that we saw in the development of educational software. The NSF paid us to look at 3 or 4, I forget, projects that were developing educational software, and to compare and contrast, find whatever we could find. It's a longer study, but this ladder model is a model of software development that is expressly designed to fix the problems that we saw. So here's just a gloss of the problems. In some of these projects, teachers discover something, they want something, they ask the programmers, and 6 months or a year later, they get a response to that, right? That's big, the big units do what they're doing, and oh, if you have something else for them to do, I'll get to that in my good time. We found that the technologists really dominated the design, that teachers really had no role. Technologists hadn't a clue, by the way. And also the teachers just felt that they were the inferior class. They were very clear that they felt, for whatever reason, that they were treated as subservient, and the technologists had no clue. I mean, some very good technologists, they regaled us with how well they got along with their teachers who were trying out and giving ideas for the development of their software. We talked to the teachers, and that was not the story that they gave us. So I developed accidentally and then noticed it and christened it the ladder model. It stands for Layered Distributed Development of Educational Resources. So this is just a model of how you might make software. And the idea is to develop tool sets and learning activities where there's a close but proper relationship to teachers and students, if you like, and the technology development. The best possible connection between the development process and the classroom, especially so as to maximally empower teachers. So here's the idea. These are the layers. In this case, it's just teachers, like districts, math science specialists, and technology specialists. There are lots of different layers that you can define. And here's what happens. The teachers have a problem. They want to do something with their kids or for their kids, and they can't get it done. But what do? Well, it's the job of the higher levels to help them with the problems that they find in what they want to do. So the problem for the teachers becomes a problem for the what I'm calling educational technologists, the district specialists, or it can be any person of modest technical expertise that can help teach teachers through a lot of things. So their job is to formulate a solution, but the caveat is you need to produce the resources so that teachers can solve their own problem. Doesn't always happen, but it's the right thing to do if you can do that. Don't solve their problem for them. Give them ideas, give them resources so that they can solve their own problem. And by the way, lots of other problems. So, so that's where the shadow green thing is. Those are the resources that solve the problem. And of course, sometimes you need to go up the ladder and find somebody who's more expert. So, quick view of a ladder project. I didn't have the model going in, but that's what we did. And it became schematized as a ladder model. The 5-year project in elementary mathematics, middle of elementary school, and it was based on a tool set that I wound up making called Chart World. So I was the technologist here. I'll give you the short version of the story. I spent 2 days a year on this project over 5 years. This was not a big deal for me, but my expertise, I have to say, with great humility, was really important for the project. It got them over some big humps and opened things up for them. The math specialist was a fellow by the name of Don Ploger at Florida Atlantic University. There were dozens of teachers involved in this project. There were hundreds of students. It culminated in a large-scale random assignment, right? Psychologists just love this kind of thing, on whether these kids that learned elementary school mathematics in significant part from this Chart World thing, did obviously better. And so here's the idea. And Don came to me and he said, well, you know, and I can say to you, you've seen these things everywhere. You have the chart of numbers from 1 to 100. I've seen them in Europe. I've seen them, I don't know, maybe they're not so popular in Canada, but I've seen these things all over the world. There's a number chart and you ask students to color in, you know, according to certain rules, color the multiples of 2, color the multiples of 3. So Don came and said he wanted to make an automated or a computer-based version of that. And I said, Don, do that yourself. I know that you can do it. And I still think to this day that he could easily have managed that, but it was a good thing that he just said, well, I can't, Andy, you have to make it for me, because I got looped into this project as a developer type who was on call just about once a year with a couple of days of follow-up, and really wonderful things happen. So here's the original microworld. There's a number chart. There are a number of menus here. There's ink. I was particularly proud of disappearing ink, so that you could paint in a pattern and then it would be there for a while and then it would just disappear. I really like that. I like the menus too. Those are things that you just cut and paste from Boxer. They're you know. So this was you know, it was a day, maybe 2, for me to put this thing together. And there are a couple of things down here of note. This is what I call a chatty microworld. It kind of tells you what it's doing and gives you suggestions sometimes. So there's this info box that it's a variable in Boxer, and it just gets set to some text when you want to tell the student something. So here's the history box is a very important part of this. Whenever you do this, the history box gets filled with textual commands to do those things. So I don't even remember what it was. It was like, click on row 2, column 4. That's you know, it's a textual representation of what you do with the mouse in order to do these things. And that, skipping a lot of things, that came to be a really important thing, because the kids then made animations of their productions and just made some edits to the history box there to explain what they were doing. So these little narrations of development, the teachers like that idea very much too. So that was a very cool thing. Yeah, I'm going to try to make this short. So this is the sieve of Eratosthenes. So this is something that Don made for his teachers. Do you know the sieve of Eratosthenes? It's finding prime numbers by crossing out composite numbers. So he made this little animation. I looked sieve of Eratosthenes up in Google this morning, and there's a little Python program that animates this. But he did it with this little tool set. I did it first manually, and then he edited it a little bit to make it more self-explanatory. This is one of his activities, which was here. You have the multiples under partners click. So when you click on a cell, all the multiples get colored in as well. And he would work with elementary school students to understand every possible pattern that you can make with multiples. And it's a pretty simple exploration, but it's a real exploration. And there's room for insight. So this is just an example of some of the many things that he did. Now I'm going to go back to the ladder model. So Don, once a year, literally, he would come back to California and tell me the problems that he had, things that he wanted, and so I would spend a day or two helping him out, changing the tools so that it would do what he and his teachers wanted to do. So things got changed. The teachers wanted interactive capabilities so that well, I'll show you an example so I won't explain that in the abstract. You need things like the teachers needed to be able to query the state of the chart, which was, all of these things were really easy. So my job was terribly easy, but I had to be there in order to do those things because they couldn't manage these things. Simplified the macro language. Later on, I'll just show you one example of that, facilitating artistic expression. He worked with high school kids, and they really got into making pretty numerical pictures, and I'll show you just an example of that in a moment. And that artistic expression thing for me was exactly two things. One was I put a variable, a flag in there to stop the printing of numbers when it goes through all the squares and puts the color there. But literally, I had to put if flag is false, then don't print the number. So I just had to find the right place to put that one command. But they couldn't do it. So I was there to help out. And they wanted the ability to play with colors. They were really interested in this color stuff. So I literally just sent them the tools that we had made for that image processing work. Just package it up, send it to Don, and that solved their problem. They were really happy using those tools. So yeah, this is just, I'm going to try to skip this, but this, a teacher had an idea about something that she wanted to do, and she couldn't figure out how to do it. She couldn't figure out how to do it because it was impossible to do it with Chart World as it was written. This is a letter I got from Don that says, this teacher asked me to do this particular thing. I don't know how to do it. Well, I sort of know how to do it, but I'm sure you have better ideas, or maybe you can send me a tool. So he's playing his role in the ladder model perfectly. He's asking somebody who has more technical expertise, and he wants ideas and he wants tools. He doesn't want a solution to that particular problem. So that's just exactly what the model's about. I already talked about this. Students wanted to make pretty colored pictures with Chart World, modifications and extensions, hide numbers, landscape color tools. Those are the solution that I provided. And this is the kind of thing that the high school students were producing. So I love it too. This is really brilliant. And I can explain to you how he made it, but that would be taking the pleasure away from you. One of the things that I missed, I really want to tell you, is that Don didn't like my initial tool. He hated the menus. He wanted kids to use keystrokes to control the thing. And he reported to me that kids vastly preferred just being able to type keystrokes for these various operations. So what did he do? He cut the menus out and he put them in the closet, which is a part of every box where you can hide stuff. So he didn't even delete them. He just put them out of sight. So, you know, this is a very concrete environment that you can just, and he also hated disappearing ink. I don't know why he hated disappearing ink. I thought it was such a good idea. He literally just put his cursor after the disappearing ink box and hit the delete key, and it was gone. So that's how concrete these environments are. So now let me review, and then I'll be done. Computational media and new literacies is the big picture here, the thing that I would like people to take seriously and think about how we're going to teach and learn things really differently with computation. Remediation, a lot of times computation can just change the way people can think about things. It did for motion. I'm quite sure a lot of other things can be done in that way. I know, because I've done some other things, not just motion. But exploring that is an important thing that we should be doing. Revising the structure of engagement, you've probably gotten the idea, and it's good that you've gotten that idea. If you have, that I'm focused on engaging students, on making space for them to do things that they like to do. So those color tools were not because we didn't think of just providing students with pre-made colors. We put that in because we figured kids will figure out something interesting to do with it besides what we needed it for this particular place. And that's just an emblem, making room for students to do things that they really cared about, and not only the things that we care about. It's almost always a learning experience, but that's a hard sell in most schools. Open tool sets is this kind of meta model of how we can make educational software that really serves kids and teachers down in the trenches, taking ideas from them, making those ideas work, or making something that's better. I really love the model. I'm sorry. Open tool sets first. Just the idea that you make a few of these boxes and you just make them available to people, and they make whatever they want out of them by hooking them together in various ways. And then the ladder model, a new form of production of educational software. So that's the end. Oh, or is it the beginning? Okay. Well, I'm working on, many of you know by now, I'm working on a new textbook in physics that's going to be computational based. So there's a lot to do, and if this is actually going to take 100 years or more, there's a lot of time to do it, but we better get started, is my thought. And this is just an informational slide. The book that you can go to learn all about these ideas is called Changing Minds. Boxer, we're bringing Boxer back, but it doesn't quite exist yet, but very soon it will. Depending on your level of technical competence, I can give you a working thing, but it's best if you wait a little bit until it's more debugged, until we have some introductory materials. My wife and I formed a foundation, a charitable foundation, to support to advocate for computational literacy and to support people in doing that kind of work. And Boxer will be available there, but we're not quite there yet. So that is really the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor diSessa. Before we go with your questions, I think you will have quite a few. We will first hear the reaction from our invited reactor, Dr. Brent Davis from University of Calgary, where he currently holds a Verklung Research Professorship. Prior to this, Dr. Davis was Canada Research Chair in Mathematics Education in the Ecology of Learning at the University of Alberta. And even prior to this, Brent Davis taught secondary school mathematics for a few years. His research focuses on the educational relevance of recent developments in the cognitive and complexity sciences. He has published books and articles in the areas of mathematics learning and teaching, curriculum theory, teacher education, epistemology, and action research. The principal foci of his research are teachers' disciplinary knowledge of mathematics and the sorts of structures and experiences that might support mathematics teaching, mathematics learning among teachers. He has authored 8 books, and his scholarly writings have appeared in Science, Harvard Educational Review, Journal for Research in Mathematics Education, and other leading journals. Dr. Davis is currently involved in a SSHRC-funded project with Krista Francis at University of Calgary, Natalie Sinclair at SFU, and Kathy Bruce at Trent, focused on using emergent technologies to develop mathematical objects and actions to think with. In 2020, in our online seminar series on programming in mathematics education, we had the pleasure to hear Brent together with Krista as they presented their work on this idea of mathematical objects and actions to think with, and which is related to their poster presentation tomorrow. Brent, we are delighted to have you with us and look forward to hearing your critical, probably as I know you, and nuanced perspective to Dr. diSessa's keynote presentation. Please.
So I was very happy to hear Andy mention that he's an opinionated person. So am I. This should go well. Apologies for spelling mistakes and grammatical errors through this. I was editing as the presentation was happening. Most of this commentary is based on actually the published paper, not the presentation, but you'll notice some aspect based on the presentation, and I'll try to be quick. First of all, I'm going to situate myself in where I sit in the evolution of technology and mathematics education. And this is not intended so much as where I sit, but actually what has happened over the, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but the last 64 years. Yeah. So my parents were an engineer and a teacher, and they loved mathematics and they instilled that in us. And one of the ways they did that is, you know, the 2-year-old and 3-year-old that asked the question why, they reformulated that for me and my 4 siblings, that we were allowed to ask why, but it was always framed in terms of what happens when you, to invite us to, so that's why, get that, WHWY. Yeah, my mother's actually written about this. Look it up. My mother and my 3 elder siblings, my next elder sibling is only a year older than me, went through high school with the technology, high school mathematics with the technology of slide rules. I did not learn about slide rules in school. When I came a year after my older brother, Mark, it was handheld calculator. My family experienced that transition, and it was quite a transition because it moved from why questions that could only be managed with one computation at a time to why questions that involved a sequence of rapid calculation. You just enter something, press the equal sign, and you got a whole sequence of things. It was like categorically different experience. My teaching experience, by the time I finished my education degree, graphing calculators were on the scene, personal computers were filling mathematics classrooms, and fractal geometry and the beginnings of complex modeling were happening. And that allowed a whole different category of why questions. It presented you could be presented with whole forms suddenly, and not just a sequence of calculations, but a sequence of forms. And today's students with robotics and other kind of interactive screen-based tools, people can actually engage with the creation of complex phenomena in real time. And it is an absolutely fascinating thing to me, like the calculation technologies, computational technologies that they're able to use right now, the movement and interaction generating things that give you responsive computations. Fascinating thing. So that again, that's the history. That's a history I experienced, but it is a history of, I think, technology and mathematics education for the last half century or so. So setting some context for my commentary. Andy wrote on his context screen that the computer is a once in several centuries innovation. I read this before he read it out loud, that the computer is several centuries of innovation at once. I think this is the bigger insight. Stay with me with this. So I will get back to that. So what's computational? I want to ask the question, what's computational literacy? And I'm asking it of you, Andy, but I'm gonna set it up because I don't know that we actually know what this is. It's a great phrase, but I'm going to give 3 different answers according to 3 different technologies that are available out there. First of all, whenever I have a big question, I ask Google Image, and I see it as kind of this cultural ink blot test. It tells us what we're thinking, that we don't know that we're thinking. And what this particular ink blot test told me is that we really don't know what it is. My favorite one, and you may not be able to read much of this, but you can do your own Google search, is the one on the upper right that seems to present computational literacy as the love child of digital literacy and computational thinking. I don't know how to think about that, but maybe it is. If there's any image, yeah, I won't even ask you to do that. That's painful. Second great authority in our world is, of course, Wikipedia. And this is their response, just highlighting it. I think a key detail that computational literacy is about awareness, and then my thing is covered up. I'm knowing that you can't read, I'll read it out loud. Awareness of the range, scope, and limitations of computational techniques. I'm not sure that matches with what I inferred from your presentation, what computational thinking is about. But one of the reasons I wanted to put this particular definition up there is on Wikipedia, the second paragraph mentions you. Now, there's no additional definition, or not much more offered here. I just wanted to put that up. Third great authority, ChatGPT. And when I asked it to define it just this morning, this is what we got, highlighting 3 elements of this. That it is the ability to understand and use what is that word? It's hidden for me. Computers. All I had is the co. So computers and computational tools effectively. Ability to think critically about the ways in which computing technology shapes our world. I have the screen right up there. I didn't need to do that. And being able to read, write, and think in a world that is increasingly shaped by digital technology. So this is, I think, a kind of a critical detail in understanding and appreciating what you were talking about for us. So I'm going to invite you, but I'm going to limit you to 2 minutes because I have other things to say. What would you say to these definitions? Are they in the zone? What, if you were editing ChatGPT, what would you say?
Yeah, they're not in the zone.
Okay.
They're ontologically wrong.
Okay.
They're saying what you can get in your head plausibly right now. That's not what a computational literacy is. It takes 100 years to know what that means. we're thinking differently.
So,
Less than 2 minutes.
yeah, less than, but so I know these are wrong. What's right?
Literacies are the accomplishment of civilizations. So no person can have them in their head now. It doesn't make any sense to say, what's the definition of computational literacy? Because we just don't know. We don't know how much of schooling and ideas and thinking and thought can be improved or advanced with computation. So of course, we don't know what that's going to look like. If there are only trivial literacies that develop from this, then I will have been wrong. If this turns out to be a very deep 100 years long project, then I will have been proved right. And not because I know where it's going to go, but because I predict that we can get somewhere doing that. And computational thinking, I just gave an interview for an European AI journal, and they wanted to talk about computational thinking. And I told them that computational thinking is a social movement. And it has the properties of a social movement. It does not have the properties of an idea. So you find that computational thinking means many things to many people. And that's just so, because it's people saluting this slogan of computational thinking. So we can begin when we change the ontology. Computational thinking is not something that we can define now. We don't know very much about, how this might go, but certainly people are moving in that direction. And although it's not explicitly in the direction of computational literacy, it can aid us in my social movement, which is to try to create a computational literacy. So is that?
That is exactly where I was hoping you would go. So
well, there I am. And now you're prepared. Now you're prepared to refute me.
Emerging phenomena that resists definition in the very fact that it is emerging. That said, it is an evolving form, but current versions of AI, which I know are not actually AI, but the popular ones that we are encountering right now, how are they participating, or how are they compelling revisions in meanings, definitions, interpretations, thinking about what computational literacy is? It changes the program massively for me. Does it for you?
Well, I just don't know. As much thinking as I've done so far, it doesn't change the equation very much.
Okay.
Because I kind of know what the technology can do, and it's pretty limited. It's I have my list of things that this technology inherently cannot do. I would sit down and argue for several hours that GPT does not have any concepts. By my personal definition of concepts that I've worked on for dozens of years, GPT can be demonstrated not to have concepts. So that's kind of a problem.
Okay, so you're welcome, everyone. I'm not going to ask him to go there. But I would like to hear that, actually. So turning a slightly different angle, but it's actually the same angle. I teach a lot of advanced research methodologies courses. This is a graphic that I use at a culminating point in the course that is about as much about the relationship among different methodologies and research attitudes as it is about their differences. And sort of to understand a methodology, you have to understand how it sits in relation to others. I was going to say more about that, but that's enough. With that relationship frame in place, you can start to ask questions about questions. One category of question is, and very popular in educational research, is just exploratory research that generates descriptive sorts of reports that are focused on description. Another category is analytical research that generates explanatory kinds of reports. And another is activist-focused inquiries that usually result in interventionist-focused reports. I like to think that these are sort of, one relies on the outer model, the outer layers rely on the inner layers. To take on the outer layer without having taken on an inner layer is highly problematical. We need to understand something before we try and change it. That in mind, in which circle or circles does your discussion fall, and, or rephrased, are we talking here? What are we talking here? Listening to you, it sounded like you were describing lots of different classroom experiences. It had the feel of a classroom, of a report. But really, when I listened more deeply, and this is my projection, it was sort of an evidence-based assertion of grander educational possibilities. It was a commentary, but really, when I listened even more carefully, I'm pretty sure you were offering us a manifesto. That is an invitation to do math and science education differently. And that computational literacy is a key in doing it differently, both in means and sort of orienting attitude. Anywhere close?
How much time do I have?
1 minute.
I'll try to be really, really short. There are a lot of things going on here, and I don't mind participating and doing a lot of things at once.
Yes.
I am a scientist deeply at my heart, and what I consider my best work, none of you want to read, I suspect, because it's technical understanding of how people learn in terms of new concepts and new empirical techniques. But that science affords me the possibility of watching kids learn and telling you moment by moment what's going on in their heads that allows them to do things differently. Now, that is very hard. It takes a lot of time. I can't do that on a daily basis, but all of our work, well, some of it has been subject to that micro scientific view. I do feel like I'm trying to create a manifesto of sorts. I am trying to recruit people into this large-scale program. I can't tell them exactly what to do, but a lot of people here I know kind of understand. So I don't feel like I'm speaking in tongues. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on there. The explanatory is probably completely missing from this particular presentation. I'm giving a talk for a particular purpose, and probably the most important thing I'm trying to do is to inspire people to think at a higher level and in a different way about what's going on. So I'm being very activist there. There's no science that tells me that I should, that I have to do that or I should do that. The science of movements is very poor. I wish it were better. I wish it were better developed. So there's potentially a lot of science there, but that level and kind of thing here was just wasn't at the scientific level. So it is more like a manifesto than a piece of science.
Cool. So I was going to ask the question, am I hearing correctly? And I hear that I am, so I'm not going to ask it. This is a piece clipped out of the article that is in your program. If you want to look at it, it's there. To the rest of us, I would encourage us to ask, how are we imagining our positions individually, collectively, as observers describing that inner layer, as analyzers explaining, or as activists intervening? How are you positioning yourself? Why are you here? Why, and think nested circles. I know why I'm here. I'm just trying to make sense of the world. I'm in the first circle. Still wondering if I'm hearing correctly, though. We've come a long way in our understanding of the dynamics of mathematics learning. And if you haven't read Andy's work on p-prims and I just about said objects to think with, but that seemed more proper. What am I thinking of? Knowledge in pieces and other, like, it's fabulous stuff. And I would dare say we have come so far in our understandings of mathematics learning that we can teach mathematics demonstrably better just by implementing what we have learned about teaching mathematics, if we could figure out how to implement it. But we've hardly moved at all around matters of curriculum content. And teaching virtually the same content in Alberta schools that we taught when I went to high school and when my mother went to high school. So yes, we can teach mathematics demonstrably better, but is there much point to doing it better? We are teaching increasingly irrelevant stuff, perhaps. So in the paper and in the presentation, I think Andy presented the idea that computational literacy presents this opportunity to do something really differently, that it will surpass, it will dwarf algebra and calculus. You believe that, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Got it.
Good on you. I share that hope, but it's got to happen in the same institutions, right? Can we really expect anything to change anytime soon with the educational institutions we have? So do you actually hold out hope for institutional change, that being a manifesto? And yeah, should we be expecting or hoping for a more dramatic evolution? I think that might be a rhetorical question, but if we can reduce it to a yes or no.
So look, if you give me 100 years, then institutions might change.
Yeah, I agree. So with that in mind, are we dreaming here?
I don't think we're dreaming only in that we don't know what it's going to be like, but it's going to be very different. And I sure hope the institutions change as a result of that. But I don't know about cultural change and institutional change. All I have is intuitions about that. No science.
All right, last slide. This is a reference to Jeanette Wing. Anybody who's been involved in trying to influence mathematics education, and I'm assuming science education, keeps getting derailed by the great idea of the moment that has nothing to do with improving teaching, but that just occupies the minds of the teaching profession for some time. Right now in school math in Canada, we have these obsessions with group work, personalized strategies, multiple representations, vertical surfaces, things that have not been demonstrated to be in any way indexed to improved learning. But they dominate discussions of improving teaching. I don't know why. In the paper and in some of the not very complimentary references to Jeanette, I have to say, but in the winged version of computational, this should say thinking, not literacy, but that promise of computational literacy thinking is going to improve the world. There are some good things in the list, and there are some troubling things, like haven't we all heard this before? Isn't mathematics supposed to be doing this? And isn't social studies supposed to be doing this? And there is this tendency to take it all as inherently good. So there are two questions on this page, and really I think your whole presentation was aimed at trying and answering them, so I won't ask you to do it again now. But in my second question around this would be in terms of, you've dangled a lot of threads, more than the five, like you've categorized them into 5 ideas, but in them, there were a lot of threads, inside them, there were threads. So moving on the dubious assertion that I really am a monotasker. As a monotasker, where should I focus my efforts? Which of the thread should I be tugging on? And I know the answer is all of them, but where do you see the biggest bang for the buck across all that you just presented?
Well, I certainly would ask you, where do you see the biggest bang for the buck? And that's a place where you should.
I do have an answer to that question.
Excellent. And where do you, so that has to be paired with where do you think you really can be making progress? So that's my answer to you in 2 questions. What do you think is, and you should do what you think is most important, and you should do the things where you think you can make the biggest difference. Don't bother with those wars.
But unfortunately, my answer for that is to trust the expert. So where do you think?
Well, you want me to choose from among those 5 things?
I do but not in a serious way. Like where would you press the hardest on your list of 5?
Well, I'm pressing hardest in teaching new things and teaching in a way that kids can really engage. Those are the 2 things. Because they're,
Yeah.
we have access to new things that were never thought to be taught. I never learned perturbation theory about orbital mechanics. I never learned it at all. I went through undergraduate years and 6 years of graduate student. I never learned it. It turns out to be comprehensible. That's a construction that I had to make. Turns out not only be comprehensible, but computationally implementable and to pose wonderful activities for students to do. And I love it. I love that kind of combination of things. That's where I'm most interested in. And it's changing the subject matter as it is a part of that. Things get passed down, hallowed and approved, but we need to tear down the house a little bit.
My heart sits in the same place. So I'm glad to end my little shtick with that. You got the right answer. So